We're going to go ahead and start. There might be some other people still joining us, but welcome tonight. Today marks the first day of Fairtrade Fortnight, raising awareness about the importance of fair trade, how we are connected around the world through the choices that we make, and the way that these choices can impact lives and livelihoods also around the world. The topic for tonight's session is a Visions for Change session, is about modern slavery. Are we complicit? It's estimated that over 20 million people around the world have been victims of forced labor, bonded labor, people who have been trafficked, coming under a broader definition of modern slavery. So are we complicit? Well, we're here to talk about that tonight. We'd like to welcome a great panel of speakers. So we're delighted to have Mei-Ling McNamara here, who is a journalist and a documentary filmmaker, whose work has appeared in The Guardian, in Al Jazeera English, in CNN International. Mei-Ling's a doctoral candidate here at the University of Edinburgh in transdisciplinary documentary film, where her work examines the political, legal, and psychological issues faced by survivors of forced labour in Britain. We're also very pleased to welcome Karen Bowman, who's our Director of Procurement. Karen has over 30 years of experience in public procurement in the NHS and in university sectors. She's built professional services on global procurement standards and fair trade policy. Karen's really been a leader here within the University of Edinburgh and within the university sector quite broadly on looking at fair trade and what this means from the perspective of a university. So we're really happy to have Karen here with us. We'd also like to welcome Cathy Galloway. Cathy's the head of Christian Aid Scotland. Cathy's work focuses on peacemaking and social justice issues, especially relating to poverty and gender. Cathy is head of Christian Aid in Scotland, and Christian Aid programs run related to climate change, disaster response and preparedness, in livelihoods, in human rights and labour rights around the world. Cathy was formerly a warden of Iona Abbey, and she's a leader of the Iona community from 2002 to 2009. And last but absolutely not least, we'd like to welcome Mary Hanlon. Mary's a PhD student here at the University of Edinburgh. I first had the great honour of meeting Mary when she was also working at CSR Asia in Asia. And over many years, I've been inspired by her work and the things that she continues to do. Mary's a PhD candidate in sociology here at the University of Edinburgh, where she's researching fashion-based activism and labour rights in the wake of the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh. So a poignant point for tonight's conversation as well. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Mei-Ling, who's going to help us to set the scene. And what do we mean by modern slavery, and look at that in today's context. We are then going to invite all of our panel speakers to come up and join us here at the front and have some questions and discussion with all of you here who've taken the time to join us. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me here this evening. It's really great to see so many of you have come tonight to hear a little bit about this issue. It's an issue that's been really, really close to my heart, something I've been working on for the last 5 years. I started on doing some stories on modern-day slavery in the UK in 2010 for Al Jazeera English as a broadcaster in investigative documentaries, looking at the issue of young Vietnamese being trafficked into the UK to work in cannabis factories. My interest, and I'll go a little bit into this in more detail a little further on, but my interest really is about how the consumer does play a part in modern-day slavery and what you can do perhaps to change that. Both stories that I've been working on, one on cannabis, wanting to look at how people view things like cannabis as quite innocuous, but in effect can be a contributor of using it to modern-day slavery. And at the moment for my doctorate, I look at how people working in the hotel industry in Scotland are also affected by modern-day slavery, people that we might see every day. So modern-day slavery is an interesting term, and I don't know how much you know about it, but it's not obviously the slavery that we know from the 15th to 19th centuries, the Atlantic slave trade. It's a new type of slavery that's been impacted by globalization, about our interconnectedness, with the world. And it has more victims than there ever has been in the history of slavery. The numbers are really difficult to come by just because slavery is so hidden. But there's an estimate. The International Labour Organization estimates there's around 21 million victims of forced labour in the UK. Some say victims of slavery is anywhere up to 30 million. So it's really, really high. It's really, really massive, and it's completely, it's nearly in every country in the world. So there are many different types of manifestations of slavery. I won't go into every single one in complete detail, but you'll hear different terms like slavery, servitude, where people actually own other people, forced labor, which we're going to be talking about a little bit more in depth today, and human trafficking, which is often tied in with that as well. People often think human trafficking is only about movement. It's not, but it's something that people often know, people moving from one place to another. People do have any questions as well. I don't know if we're going to hold to the end with the panel, but I can answer any questions you have. So I don't think I'm going to necessarily need to disabuse you of any notions about slavery, but I do want to kind of hit you with some statistics to sort of show you the breadth and scope of it. So it does affect every single demographic, slavery, and it often affects the largest, actually, group is of people of middle class incomes, which is a bit surprising. A lot of people think it's those that are impoverished that are only affected by slavery, but a lot of people from middle class in their countries are often affected by trafficking and slavery as well. An estimated 1.2 million children are trafficked each year. I think it's higher just from other global reports, but that's just an estimation. And the profits from it are huge. I mean, 31.6 billion in profits are made from the exploitation of people every year. And how is this allowed to happen? It's allowed to happen because the links between exploitation and globalization are becoming more apparent. As companies subcontract out to further and further away in poor countries that have little regulation, you're seeing a lot more exploitation happening, and that's hidden away. You mentioned, Marion, the thing on the Rana Plaza. Bangladesh is a big country for forced labor practices. The case study I'm going to talk about today is some Bangladeshi men that have come over here in Scotland that have been found in forced labor. And 161 countries are reported to be affected by human trafficking. So it's even higher for trafficking of people as well compared to forced labor. And every year, 8.1 million people lose $21 billion in lost wages through labor exploitation alone. So slavery in the UK. A new report just came out last year about how many people in slavery or forced labor they estimate are in the UK, and the numbers were a lot higher than they originally thought. They think it's anywhere between 10 to 13,000 victims of modern-day slavery, and half of those are potentially victims of forced labor or more. But there's been some really interesting movements, some new legislation that you may know about that's come out in the last year, one in England and Wales and one in Scotland, the Modern Slavery Act, and the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Bill in Scotland. And those are created to have more prosecutions of traffickers and also to protect victims. And I'll talk a little bit more of that. Oops. So the hidden nature of forced labor. The fact is that forced labor is completely subsumed within our everyday practices on our economy. It's very, very difficult to actually recognize it and see it. All of us who go shopping or buy a bottle of water or anything, it's very difficult for us to understand or know what we're actually contributing to. And that is exactly the point of traffickers and exploiters. They know that it can be hidden. They know it can be non-regulatory. So it often goes on with impunity. Now, in 2011, the European Union adopted a directive to prevent and combat trafficking in human beings and protect its victims, called the EU Directive, and the UK was signatory to joining that. And what that meant was it was going to make more of a concerted effort to speak amongst states to combat the issue, work more in concert with the authorities to prosecute, and also to not criminalize victims. a lot of things that happen in forced labor, whether it's done in the illicit economies like the hotel industry, construction, the service sector, or in illegal economies, like I mentioned, cannabis cultivation, fraud, DVD selling, benefit fraud, all these sorts of things. What this directive does to say is not the victim that should be criminalized, okay? It should be the exploiter, the trafficker. And that was a really amazing move because it meant that maybe less would be criminalized, less would be put in prison, and more would be recognized as actual victims. I just wanted to put a couple of things up. One is a recent piece I did that was looking at the children that were exploited in cannabis factories in the UK. So like I said, I did one in 2011, a documentary on it, and then I revisited it again last year. And the reason I revisited it was because the issue had not gone away. It's wonderful that we can talk about forced labor and raise awareness about it, but it is a very, very difficult problem to solve. It doesn't go away quickly, and I think over time, it can get better, people can become more aware, but what often happens is, unless there's regulation, unless there's awareness, unless there's more people making noise about it, traffickers and owners and exploiters and perpetrators, they get smart and they learn how to get around laws, they learn how to get around the police. So I did an article about how the police are really trying to keep up with a lot of these gangs and these criminal syndicates to combat forced labor. It's not all doom and gloom, but I wanted to just point out some of the challenges, and I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit more about that work after our talk today. So I just wanted to give you, would you tell me too when I'm running over or when I've got 2 minutes or something? Okay, great. This is a case study that I've been working on for the last 4 years on my doctorate, and I'm making a documentary film about it as well as a thesis, which is basically looking at the case of 4 Bangladeshi men that were trafficked into the hotel industry up in the west of Scotland. And it's really looking at how these 4 men ended up in a little hotel near Fort William to be, they saw hundreds of tourists a day. No one recognized that they were victims of forced labor. How they could be completely invisible to the authorities, the police, the border agents, the Citizens Advice Bureau, every NGO you can imagine, even after they told them about their situation, how they could let this go on for 5 years without getting justice. So I'm kind of following these men, and I'm looking at the impact that forced labor has had on their lives, not only the exploitation, but also the justice system and how long it's taken for the men to get justice. One of the points I wanted to make in my work is that a big thing for victims of forced labor is the lack of compensation for a lot of these people. So what often happens is when people go abroad or migrate to start a job, these men, for example, came over on a legal visa, a Tier 2 visa to work. So they were officially and legally sponsored by somebody who ended up being their exploiter. But they gave them each 20 to 25,000 pounds. So it was all the money they'd ever make in their lives, basically. They clubbed together from family, they sold land, they sold all their jewelry, they sold all their businesses, and they thought that that's what it cost to get a visa to the UK. And when they got here, the trafficker said, that's not your contract. Your contract is this contract, and you're actually going to have like 100 pounds a month. And if I want to pay you, I'll pay you, and if I don't, you can leave. I'll get you deported. And it's a really common scenario actually that's happening now. Is not only is people coming in illegally, not illegally, but clandestinely, but they're also coming in Heathrow on legal visas, and then they get here and. Actually, what happens is they don't know the system, they don't know the legal system, and that is a cause of manipulation by their employers. So what's been happening with these men is they've been trying to get justice, they've been trying to get compensation, and the trial only happened last August, this past August, and the trafficker, 8 counts of human trafficking, 4 men, 80,000 plus pounds, and he got 3 years. In prison, and he's appealing that right now as we speak in the Edinburgh Crown Court. So it's a really interesting and also quite difficult story to cover. And I just wanted to point here out how difficult it is to get prosecutions. So in 2006, there were only 5,808 prosecutions and 3,160 convictions throughout the world. This is an ILO statistic. This means that for every 800 people trafficked, only one person was convicted. And this is a really common scenario. So there's a lot of reasons why they do not get convicted. It's very difficult often. They cover their tracks. It's very difficult to prove sometimes. Also, people don't want to have any revenge wreaked upon them by their trafficker. It's very scary for our men. Bangladesh can be a very difficult place if you aren't a person in power. And if someone has power, they could easily erase you. This is what I'm told. So, a lot of people are afraid to speak up against their trafficker. Oops, excuse me. So, kind of boring, but I think really, really important, is two pieces of really important legislation that have come out recently that is exciting, and we will see what will happen in the coming years when precedents are set with case law. So the Modern Slavery Act, which is basically put in place by the UK government to cover all of the UK, and what it is to prosecute traffickers, to strengthen that, to protect victims, and to basically provide more kind of multi-agency support to people, and to raise awareness, obviously. And an important element of this, which is important today, is this transparency in supply chains clause, okay? So in this clause, it says, and there will be people talking about this in more detail today that are more knowledgeable than me, but it says here that companies that make over 36 million a year are required to practice due diligence in reporting on transparency in their supply chains. So they have to post it on the web, they have to report their procedures, those sorts of things. 36 million. So last year, 17,000 companies had to do that. Okay, that's quite important. The other interesting piece of legislation that's come out is this Human Trafficking and Exploitation Bill in Scotland, and it will be interesting to see how these two acts meet, because the Scottish Act actually has a provision in there, 39, which actually says that bodies corporate, any company, will be liable if slavery is found in their supply chain, and that is directors, CEOs, or whole panels or groups that are part of the official bodies of corporations. So this is a really important element around rooting out forced labor and looking at liability. So I definitely think you should keep an eye out for that. So preventing forced labor, what can we do? I don't know all the answers, but these are just some of the things that I've seen in the work I've done. Support regulation and enforcement of labor rights and trade unions. And as consumers, how can we demand greater transparency by UK businesses on slavery-free supply chains? So whether it's fair trade, whether it's joining a campaign, publicizing, writing a letter, or boycotting unethical companies. I think it's something that we should really look at. And also to challenge stereotypes about who can be a victim of slavery. So if you are in a hotel and you do see certain things that don't seem to kind of add up as to what the people are doing, ask those questions. I can't tell you all the TripAdvisors that show for the hotel that the men were trafficked in about what appalling service and what people saw, but people didn't realize that all these men were victims of forced labor and slavery. They only saw bad service, and I think maybe if they knew, people's perceptions would change. So I kind of think that's kind of me, really. I didn't want to go into too much detail today, and if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer anything. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Mei Ling. We'll have time for questions from the audience. What we want to do is invite all our panel members up to the front. I feel like we should slightly apologize for our lack of gender diversity on the panel. Sometimes we have a go at our panels because they might be too male-dominated, but we're delighted to welcome to this panel four fantastically talented women who are going to discuss more about the issue. what we wanted to do was ask each of our panel members to share their thoughts, basically in response to Mei Ling's presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. But I'm going to prompt it a little bit, and I thought I might start with Kathy, if you might start. And maybe actually if you could tell us about almost a response to the question. So we've heard from Mei Ling, are we complicit as individuals, as consumers, as citizens? Tell us more from your point of view.
Thank you. I'd like to start by sharing one of my favourite poems with you. Love is not concerned with whom you pray, or where you slept the night you ran away from home. Love is concerned that the beating of your heart should kill no one. That's a poem by Alice Walker, the African-American writer. And I really like that poem because it very succinctly states an order of ethical priorities about the importance of the preservation of life. And it has reminders of the medical precept of first do no harm. And it's also the do no harm tenet is central to UNICEF's humanitarian principles that it works by. And I think that's quite relevant to the present discussion because with the question is, modern slavery, are we complicit? That's a very big question, but actually there is no way that anyone in this room can say with their hand on their heart that the beating of their heart kills no one. We can't say that. The Christian Church has traditionally talked about sins of commission, that's the things that we do wrong, and sins of omission, and that's about the harm that is caused by what we fail to do. And I think that it's a version of in order for evil to triumph, it's only necessary for good people to do nothing. But the temptation to do nothing is really strong, because the areas of modern life where modern slavery is prevalent, as we've heard, are not just far away, because in our globalized world, nothing is just far away. We're tied up with everything. So this is not just about children laboring in Egyptian stone quarries, and it's not just about children, working on Cambodian rubbish dumps, both of which I've seen. It's not even just about sex trafficking into Europe or the abuse of domestic workers, both here, but all across, for example, the Middle East, Singapore, across the world, because we all agree that these things are terrible and something ought to be done about them. But many of the most pernicious forms of modern slavery are actually integrally tied up with things that we tend to think of as being harmless, even if they might be a bit frivolous. So these would be such things as sport, especially the beautiful game. From the child labour making footballs to the migrant workers constructing the stadia for the World Cup in Qatar. Boy, is that World Cup mired, drowned in blood, actually. And then there's fashion and the garment industry across the world. Could you raise your hand if you have a mobile phone? Okay. Can I ask you what you think is the most ethical mobile phone? Okay, Frank Poulsen, who is a Danish filmmaker, and he made a film called Blood in the Mobile, and he was asked, I was at a thing that he was speaking at, and somebody asked him that question, and he said, the one in your pocket. And then that was really just him saying, not the one that you buy, not the new one, but the one that you have and that you hang on to for as long as possible. And I think it's a real challenge to all of us, because these things are not just, our connection to modern slavery is not necessarily about being, not necessarily about, supporting traffickers or, sex trafficking. What it is about trying to challenge and make transparent the way that modern slavery is tied up with every tiny thing in our lives. What Mei-Ling was talking about was the ways in which people work and campaign to try and make that evident and transparent, and it's a big challenge, because the tendency, the temptation, is to engage in the sins of omission and just ignore it.
I'm going to thank you very much for sharing the comments. I was going to also maybe bring us to an organisational perspective and ask Karen Bowman, our Director of Procurement, sort of tell that journey and what does responsibility mean for an organisation looking at this?
It's absolutely, as Kathy said, it's a sin of omission. We're a university of about 35,000 students and I think about 15,000 staff, something like that. Each year we spend over £200 million on things, goods and services and new buildings and cameras and chairs and everything that we buy. And I think that as an institution, we've always valued the human side of things. We've got a people policy that says people should have equality and dignity. You've made a remark about the panel yourself. We should have equality, we should have dignity, we should look after people. But when we're procuring things, when we're spending money on things, if you're an academic with a very limited research grant, you want to get the most you can for the money that you've been given. And quite often, the people who make the things that you buy kind of get forgotten about, not in a bad way, just because, as Kathy said, that's just the way the world now works. And I think the fact that we've got the banner up saying we're a fair trade university, that in itself, when it happened in 2004, that was a big deal. Now it's quite, oh yeah, fair trade, we all buy the bananas and the coffee, we know what that's all about. But we've been very fortunate in Scotland, having become a fair trade nation, to have visits from people who have actually seen the direct benefit of the kind of abuse you've been hearing about. Okay, it was in a faraway place, but we had an example, I think it was 2 years ago, of a lady called Pamela who came. She worked in a garment factory when she was a child. When the inspectors came round, because it was inspected regularly, she was shoved in a rubbish bin with all the lint and all the waste. And she actually came here to our university, spoke to our students' union about this experience and how her whole life was ruined, her health was ruined, etc. And then she did get recruited by someone to work in a fair trade factory where she had rights, where she had salaries, where she had a chance to work with others in a kind of unionised way. And as a result of that, our daughter was about to go to university. And yet, she'd been an exploited child worker in that particular place. She'd landed on her feet. A lot of people, as we're hearing, have gone the other way, thinking they're coming to something great and being fully exploited. And the challenge, I think, for us in the university is the diversity of our buying, the diversity of our community, and the fact that people don't think about what they call supply chain. They just think about the people they're buying from. So we talked about phones, people buy from a brand. People buy clothes from a brand. People buy all sorts of products from a brand. And often we are told, although we're spending money that's primarily charitable or publicly funded, and we want to increase competition and get best value, actually, I want that one because I like it, I know it's good, it's of a high quality, that is what I need, be it a piece of scientific equipment or IT or whatever it is. And people don't often realise that the supply chain goes from the person you're buying all the way down to people that even the first tier of suppliers may not know, as we heard in the horrendous Rana Plaza. Some of the branded clothing suppliers did not know their products were being made in those conditions. So it is a globalisation issue. Well, they should have known, or maybe they did know. I don't know enough about the research behind it, but certainly they claim not to know, shall we say. And one example that I'd just like to remind people of was the horse meat scandal. If you remember way back, there was a bit of a fuss about Findus frozen lasagna. Remember that? Horse meat in the supply chain. That was actually, eventually, after some research, it was found to have 400 different suppliers involved in that tiny little lump of stuff that people were cooking. And at the time that happened, the university court was asking, well, where do we get our lasagna that we feed our students in the halls? And we were able, through collaborative procurement and ethical procurement, to say, we buy from one butcher who won the contract for all the Scottish universities and who can tell us that he buys his meat from one abattoir, and that abattoir is licensed, and there are no horses allowed to be killed there, and we fully can see the supply chain. We know the cows, the meat goes there, the meat comes to us, we make the lasagna ourselves. So there is an element of being able to control your supply chain if you are able to buy locally. But having said that, I have heard of mushroom pickers in East Lothian being trafficked and living in the polytunnels. We had the cockle guys getting all killed in Morecambe. So, even in small local supply chains, you can still have people being exploited. But it's fortunate that as a group, universities and colleges work together, and we are working with our students, with our environmental and social responsibility colleagues, in trying to develop some sort of standards. We know they're not perfect, and we know there's a long way to go. But if we keep telling the suppliers to our community, this matters to us, this is something we really care about, we'd like to know what you're doing, please tell us where your factories are, please tell us how you're ensuring your workers have rights, please tell us what you're doing. And as we've already heard from Eileen, that if consumers demand, then people will start changing. But it's a very difficult challenge.
Thank you, Karen. That's perfect, and actually a good segue for Mary. So, Karen, you mentioned, people just don't think about issues, and time again we hear about issues that come up. Nestle's just gone out publicly and said we have slavery in our supply chains. If you're purchasing prawns that come from Thailand, chances are it will have been touched by slavery. Patagonia, a company we like to think about as being ethical in some of their productions, has come out and said actually we've got slavery in our supply chains. Years after the Rana Plaza disaster, have things changed? And Mary, if not, why not? And how do we get it right?
Well, that's a big question. And I guess that's one of the questions I'm hoping to sort of unpack a bit in my own PhD research. But I think one of the challenges with apparel manufacturing, like so many other products, you mentioned cell phone, is that, transparency is a challenge. It's a challenge because we're not talking only about where products are assembled, but we're talking about where all of the materials have come from, under what conditions cotton has been grown, for example, where it was then shipped to be woven, spun, woven, and dyed, where then it was shipped to be assembled, then how it gets to us to buy, where it goes after it leaves our life, goes to a secondhand shop, or where it goes from there when it's not sold. And I think if we can think through supply chains with all of those different multiple touch points, it becomes, because each of those different touch points, there's opportunity for labor exploitation and forced labor. It's really important to contextualize that challenge. Maybe the challenge for consumers, I know you mentioned boycotts and this question of are we complicit? I did an online survey before coming here that told me that 23 slaves work for me. I don't know if you've looked through this. Do you have 54? Although they didn't ask about drugs on the thing, so you're thinking about cannabis.
Probably a lot more for people.
Yeah. And I think there's lots of tools that consumers can use to kind of think through products in terms of the wider supply chain and all of the different things that come into play. But the challenge with that as well is that there's not always space for context and contextual in-depth analysis, because each circumstance, each touch point has very unique contextual elements that need to be examined so that worker voices are respected and heard, because each of those countries will have different rules and regulations, and how they're enforced will be completely different. So from a consumer perspective, in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza collapse, I think what I've seen and in terms of fashion activism and consumer activism, is a kind of trend toward 3 options for consumers. There's a sort of trend where you can either boycott or calls for boycott, which, as I mentioned, can be problematic when you're thinking about, okay, boycott what? Boycott one brand, boycott cotton, boycott Bangladesh. I mean, you know, and also problematic when we hear from labor rights activists in these countries that are calling, you know, please don't boycott. We don't want you to boycott. So that's a really clear message. So there's challenges around that. That's sort of the one option that's presented. Another option that's presented is to not buy. So to kind of lean out your lifestyle and don't buy at all. And there's a concern that if you're not buying, that somehow means that you're no longer complicit in this system, and that you don't have to do anything more about slave labor because you haven't bought in. And I think that's also needs to be unpacked further, because I feel complicit. I think we're all complicit. And then this third option that's kind of that's grown is this idea of boycotts. So rather than boycott or not buying anything, but to buy better. So you see people moving toward buying fair trade products or products that are labeled, that are attempting to be more transparent with their supply chains. And there's challenges around this as well, because there's questions about, is buying better also now, are you now no longer complicit because you bought better? And when you have this strong message coming from worker advocates and labor rights activists telling you not to boycott, but then you're buying something else. So I think the challenge for consumers is to really unpack all of that and to say, okay, we need to get comfortable with the messiness that is labor in the supply chains of the products that we use every day in our lives, and to really kind of not take these simple option solutions as at face value. I think that's what I would say since Ranapod. So there's a lot more awareness and a lot more discussion, but I think what's missing still is this in-depth contextual analysis about how we can move forward for sustainable solutions for labor rights.
Thank you to all of our speakers. We're going to open it up for any questions that you might have. So you've heard some different perspectives on issues of modern slavery. What comes to mind? What questions does that raise for you? And questions you'd like to ask? Yes. If you could introduce yourselves as well when you ask a question.
Hi, my name is Maria Pakpahan. I'm also a PhD student here. I used to work for the ILO 2004, 2005, 2016, actually the international program anti-trafficking and the forced labor is international program, and I was working for the regional one, covering 5 countries. And after 10 years, you know, listening to this, you know, it's just more wound is open, because I think I don't know about UK so much, but I know UK ratifying the Forced Labor Convention 1930, which then also ratified the protocol 2014, which would make it binding for the UK. So the case, for instance, the one in Fort William, that actually can be approached through the Forced Labor Convention. And every year, the ILO organizes this tripartite meeting, which is government, trade union. I hope this trade union is here, which usually very sexist to the so-called informal sectors, which is a lot of migrant workers or people, you know, not being in the formal sector and they not become organized, to bring the case using that instrument basically, because the government have to responsible, and also the third sector will be the employers. Mm-hmm. So this tripartite, which is very, very unique for the ILO, that's when every country in the world, members of ILO, of the UN, will monitor each other basically, and will be, you know, sanctioned in terms of humiliation and so on, and what kind of best practices to bring. And I'm agree that we all, you know, complicit in a way. And one of the approach, I think, for the younger generation, I think I really being reminded by my son when he was 9, like to buy fair trade, like even like chocolate and so on, because sometimes we're just so busy with daily life, and just, you know, looking for something, you know, like whatever you like, without really unpacking what the story behind that, what you like, you know.
Thank you.
Whether it's cheap stuff or, you know, cheap garments, whatever.
Thank you for that reminder. Did you have a particular question that you wanted to
I just want to know,
the
basically, we can be kind of you know, like we feel that we already do a lot of things, but does the university actually doing a monitoring, you know, on their supply chains? Because, you know, I'm very glad to hear about this mushroom picker things, you know, because like when we already convenience with, okay, we have a clean, you know, abattoir and so on, but how do you ensure that's always happening?
Thank you.
Know,
That's
is
a
that
good.
like 2-3 years, monitors or whatever?
That's a good question. I could chip in, but I should be a good be a good chair and ask
I
Karen
love
to
to be able
answer.
to say that we monitor all our supply chains, but I cannot honestly do that. But what I can say is we're quite a big buyer, but we're actually very small in a lot of the markets that we're operating in. But what we are doing as a university is trying to influence others to work with us. So for example, as well as being the Fairtrade, one word, Fairtrade, we've also joined the Workers' Rights Consortium, which was a group that began in America about where do you get your branded clothing from. So we joined that. We're trying to work with our clothing providers, but we don't buy a lot of clothing compared to what students buy in their own budgets. We're also members now of the Electronics Watch, which is a similar idea. It's been set up with European money and NGOs all around Europe working together with cities and other buying bodies to say, let's try and hold the electronics industry to account, not in a bad way, not boycotting, not stopping people doing their research or anything like that, but actually trying to find out what is really happening in the factories. But the challenge we have there is, although we're, public procurement in Europe is a lot of money, the actual brands are the global buyers. They're buying from their supply chains. And I think somehow we're going to have to work with our supply chains. And that's why I welcome with the new Modern Slavery Act, although I don't fully understand how the university can implement all the requirements. But if we're talking about big companies having to do this anyway, who have got any sort of transactions around that 30 million value in the UK, then the purchasing people in those companies will be looking into this. So we should work with the companies rather than try and say we're not going to buy from you because you don't know where your factories are or you won't tell us. So we're actually trying to look at it as a risk assessment. Everywhere's got risk, but where's the biggest risks? What can we actually do where we can make a bigger impact? So food, for example, is, it's not easy, but it's relatively easy. Then we have to think about IT, and then we have to think about garments, then we have to think about buildings. And in each stage, trying to work with other universities and colleges, and I really welcome the idea of working with the researchers so that we're learning from your knowledge, where are the biggest industries, the biggest countries, the biggest risks, so we can actually bring that to bear in considering how we buy. But, and it's a big but, we're actually obliged to treat all companies fairly and equally as well. So in Scotland, there's new laws coming in April, which come from Europe and also Scottish government, that say we can stop using companies if they've been convicted of certain behaviours. But as we've heard, getting convictions is very difficult. It's not a full answer, but it's showing you that we're working towards something.
Thank you very much, Karen. Yes, if you could introduce yourselves in your question.
Hi, I'm Jess. I was just wondering, on your presentation there was a map of Europe and it had different colours for each country. So I was wondering if you could explain what that meant.
Oh, sorry, that was from an interactive documentary I was making. It was a pilot project we were doing about how to make an interactive doc on human trafficking. So that was just a graphic that we'd been put together about hotspots and things like that. So I'm just trying to make the subject of slavery accessible and fresh as well. I think some of the issues around us talking today is really, really relevant because we're talking about new legislation, we're talking about what we're doing new. I think sometimes the arguments and the discussions could get tired because people hear slavery or forced labor and they're like, yeah, I know. But actually it's really important to keep it fresh, I think, and keep moving the conversation forward. So we're all trying to do that, I guess.
Thank you. What we might do now is take maybe 3 questions and then I will direct these at our panel members. So maybe if we get 3 people, maybe start, yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Sonza. I'm a student here at University of Edinburgh. Thanks so much for the information. I think we've been talking a lot about labour slavery here, and then I'm just wondering, is there any other drivers for modern slavery in a probably more general sense, and then what the situation is right now, and perhaps like what you see that in the near future or something.
Fantastic. So there's our first question. We're going to take 2 more and then go to also in the back row, very back, and then come up to the front.
My name is Julian. I'm a student at engineering school, and so I was just at a meeting with the USA president and other conveners of the School of Engineering and other from the school in the King KB, and we're discussing the price of food. Most agreed cheap is better. cheap inconsistencies. So how do you change the mindset of students that want to get cheap and a lot of food? And I guess this is not only for students, that would impact a lot of people, but students because they have a tighter budget and because we're in Edinburgh Uni. I think it's like an important aspect to change the mindset of people and how you would be able to do that.
Thank you. And one more question here from the front, if you still have your question, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I work for an environmental charity called Changeworks based in Edinburgh. My question is, from what I can see, there are quite a few initiatives to map supply chains for environmental reasons, so whether it's carbon or otherwise. So my question is, do you think that these initiatives to map supply chains for environmental reasons should be taking more responsibility for social impacts such as slavery? One example that comes to mind is the Marine Stewardship Councils. I know that there's discussions at the moment about, they're going out on ships and they're assessing the sustainability of various kind of stocks around the world, and there are ships going out with enforced labour on these ships. And should they be actually acknowledging that and having that a part of their accreditation?
Fantastic. I think that's a really good question. I'm going to ask our panel. So we're going to start with the first question on what drives modern slavery. And I might look to Kathy for that, because Kathy, your organisation, Christian Aid, tries to work at the root causes of issues like this. So what's driving it? And how do we get to the root cause?
I think it's one of the, the factors of the globalised economy that actually you go back and you go back and you go back and you go back. And if you start with the kind of, the raw materials, and, what is it, what are the deals being made, often by multinational companies, about resource extraction, where resources are, raw materials are taken away to be processed somewhere else. And whatever the process is, the money is in the processing. So it's like the miners or whoever it is are operating in ways that are highly dangerous, highly illegal, often they're bonded labour basically, and at the same time the companies are extracting highly advantageous terms of very, very poor governments. So, this takes you back to tax dodging, basically. That's a huge issue for countries. And climate change is another thing that's driving. It's driving migration. It's driving, dispossessed people in all sorts of ways. Everything you go back, and it's not easy. I mean, if you try and track down, miners, for example, try and track down where accountability ultimately lies. I once was trying to track down a diamond mining company in Sierra Leone, and I went through 9 different holding companies of one kind or another, till I eventually tracked down a board, that was registered somewhere in, I can't remember, Bermuda or the Channel Islands or something, but it's a multinational board. So it's really hard to hold people to account. So I think it's really important to just keep putting pressure on in terms of the transparency and public awareness. Film is such an important medium in this, such as a documentary or whatever, so important.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes,
as well?
Mei-Ling over here.
I think you're absolutely right in looking at those broader issues. And I also want to say that, from the people I've interviewed, we talk about economic deprivation or things. Just often it's just looking for a better life for their families. And a lot of times people don't necessarily want to stay in those places, like we look at Nepal or who go over to the Middle East, Nepalese or other groups. They want to go home. They just want to make their money, and which is the story of migration often. People go and they make a better life, and they sometimes send money back home, or they go back. And so often it's just the simplest thing about trying to get a better life, that they would make more money in a couple of years than they would ever see in their lifetime. And it isn't necessarily greed, it's just a choice they want to make to improve the lives of their wives, their children, their partners, their families. So it's a very basic need, I think. And that it does seem to be the driver. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, when we talk about loopholes and people who can manipulate that. And they see that need and they think, oh, I can easily deceive them to do that. So yeah, that's what I see a lot.
Thank you, Mei Ling. And Mary, you're doing some of your research is on the interface with the consumer. So the question on the related to the price of food and the price of garments as well too. What are the trade-offs and why isn't more happening there?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question or inquiry. And I think it connects, I think, to root causes in a way, because I think in the context of fashion and consumers in fashion, we talk a lot about fast fashion as being a driver, as kind of just making situations where you have lead times that are unrealistic for workers to meet these deadlines, and so you're pushing labor to its limits. But I think questioning our own lifestyle choices is something that actually is really difficult and can be it's not so simple as just saying questioning your purchasing habits. It's actually getting to the root of the lifestyles that we have and maintain. And I think with your question with food, and this speaks to fashion as well, is that there are certain people that are legitimately cannot afford to buy more expensive products, and then there are people who are kind of taking advantage of the products that are quite cheap. So I think it depends on the consumer. I mean, it's a tough one. I can't really say more than that. I think context again is quite key there, because when we're talking about fast fashion as a driver for labor exploitation, it is typically that we're talking about fast fashion consumers all as the same person or the same type of consumer. And I think unpacking actually who is shopping on the high street and the pressures that they're feeling in their own lifestyle, how we as society drive that. I think that's actually quite a deep-rooted problem that we need to address. And addressing it's very uncomfortable, because we have to start having conversations about our own being complicit in global capitalism and how we are able to maintain these lifestyles. I think it kind of unravels, it can keep going. So,
and it's really hard to do on your own, so I think it's really important to belong to a group that's...
No, thank you for that. And that kind of links into the standards question, because what choices do you make and what can standards tell us about that? And actually your question, Hannah, about the integration of standards, I might put that one to Karen to say, how do we make those choices? I think that
you've touched upon really what is the whole nub of what the university and everybody else who's spending their own money or other people's money have to think about, is what is the value for money. You want a good quality product at a good price. If you go for cheap, you either lose quality or you lose other things. And I think the other things often get forgotten about. You can get very cheap things that are very badly made, or you can get very expensive things that are made very cheaply because somebody's taken a huge amount of profit out of it. And I think one of the things in my professional procurement we're trying to do is be more transparent and encourage our suppliers to be more transparent. And that covers a whole lot of things. Where are all the cost elements of this product? And is there anywhere we can save money without exploiting other people, each of us, by trying to save money in the way we buy or the way we organise or the way we order or the way we pay. And I think the point about the standards is there are now standards. There's a whole lot of standards, as you said, Hannah, for environmental matters. And what, as a university and college group, we've been trying to do, and we are at the beginning of a process, we're trying to ask our suppliers, do you adhere to all these ILO standards? Do you adhere to all the relevant environmental standards for the product or goods that you're providing? If you do, please tell us which standards you meet, and then please ask your suppliers, and then the next layer and the next layer. Now, it's taken us about 1.5 years just to get the questions together and to get at least an idea that this could work for us. And the only reason it's working is because we're doing it together as all the universities and colleges in Scotland. But it's taken a long time to get the first layer of suppliers. We've only got 1 or 2 suppliers who've actually filled it in, because they don't actually know. The people we're dealing with are not their buyers. It's their sales or their account manager or their Scottish rep or the UK rep, the European rep. And you say to them, have you got any slaves in your supply chain? Or have you got any people who are not entitled to maternity leave or whatever other labour issue? And they don't really know. So I think the more people talk about it, and the new legislation, as you said, trying to make it fresh, trying to make it interesting, can actually encourage customers, consumers to ask the questions. And I think we are trying to look at it as the whole supply chain, right back to the raw materials, the production, the distribution. If you think about Amazon as a company, they have distribution centres, they're buying from all over the world, they're making millions and millions of pounds. and there's all the stories of exploitation of 0 hours labour. I mean, they're not slave labour, but they're not getting paid. Some of them, they're going late, you know.
I mean, there is, that's the thing, I think it's how policy really translates into practice, because, you know, we have the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, that they're a regulatory body that looks over the fishing industry and other industries. But once they were brought into I'm on tape, am I? Okay, once they were brought into the Home Office in 2014, 40%, their investigations went down by 40%, right? So there's a lot less investigations being done. Now, it is, you know, this Modern Slavery Act is fantastic, and the Scottish Human Trafficking Bill is fantastic, but how that translates into practice and how much they use these regulatory bodies to really check is critical. And I think that's what we have to see in the coming months and years. You know.
Mei-Ling, can we ask you in a way to answer your own question? So we now have this fantastic, the Modern Slavery Act. Do we think that will bring about change? And how can things just like transparency, you know, from a supply chain perspective also help with that? What are your thoughts?
I mean, what I'm struggling with right now is, I mean, this case that, you know, you said that they can use these ILO, you know, the UK signatory to. The problem with the case I'm working on is it happened in 2010. So a lot of the, you know, the things that they can use to fight against a trafficker is not going to be relevant. But I think that if we look to cases happening now, if we look at more prosecutions and stuff, we also have to look at victim support and care. You know, you talk about, it's not a simple solution about boycotting, or it's not a simple solution about, you know, cracking down on people that exploit. You know, we have to look at the lives of people affected and how that impacts their lives. And it's a big charge for any consumer to think, okay, I got to think about this, I got to think about this. But I think on a personal level, you know, if you try and do your homework the best. I mean, I just got some my husband bought some coconut milk like a couple weeks ago or something. And I was like, have you written to them about, you know, whether or not they're using these, you know, their orangutans, and you know, checking Borneo and checking all this stuff. And, you know, I wrote to the company and I asked them about like labor, and then they wrote back and they told me what they do and how they're getting a label and everything. And it's, like you say, everyone's complicit, but I think we can try and do our part in the best way possible, and you know, and be interested in these stories of slavery in the UK as well as wider, because, you know, if we do get interested, it means that, you know, we're actually showing that we're not going to put up with it here, and it's something that is not welcome here. So we just have to look and see. I mean, one last thing I want to make is that, you know, the government is really in many ways telling us two messages, okay? We have an immigration bill that's coming through that's cracking down on making this place not comfortable or safe for illegal immigrants. And then on the other hand, we have a Modern Slavery Act. But we have to know that sometimes these issues can get conflated, and victims of slavery can get mistaken for illegal immigrants. So I think, you know, as students and people interested in this issue, you know, it's your responsibility to like not just take everything at face value, and to really like investigate yourselves and look deeply into it and see what happens. So that's all I would say, really. There's no quick answer, I guess.
That's okay. Thank you.
Maybe refer to an example of fair trade. I mean, if you think about 10 years ago, people weren't buying those kind of products. They didn't know what the label meant. They didn't understand what it was all about. And there's lots of people now criticising the labelling scheme, and it does, you know, it costs money and it's an effort, and it maybe doesn't deliver all the wonderful promises. But it became a groundswell from the bottom up, through the church movement, through you know, Whole Food type shops and various places promoting it. And I think that's kind of maybe an example. If people started questioning suppliers and said, are you fair trade? Have you got slavery? Have you thought about, are your workers got rights? You know, if the public started asking, and then if buyers like myself and other bodies started asking, it becomes a bottom-up thing. Because I think the law can only do so much. I think demand, shareholders, those kind of people can change the way people want to behave.
So as consumers, as organisations, using our leverage, isn't it, to ask the questions. Dave, you have to introduce yourself just in case.
To introduce myself, Dave Gorman. I'm Director for Social Responsibility and Sustainability at the University, so work closely with Michelle and Karen and lots of other colleagues to think about these issues. I had a comment and then a question which are possibly related. So I used to be a regulator, and we traditionally in regulation the law is passed and then you have a way of implementing it. So you give people a license and then you go and check their site, and you might do it slightly differently, but generally there's a kind of way of approaching it. And then we realized over time that that was quite a poor way, really, and that the problem was mutating and that we needed to think about new ways of solving the problem. So in the old days, went to BP down at Grangemouth. It was a big site. You gave it a permit. You checked whether the things coming out the chimney were the things that were supposed to come out the chimney. Then you were faced with people who were trafficking in drugs, in people, and in environmental crime, who would murder you, really, if you turned up on their site with a little checklist. So we worked with the police. And I was thinking about just while you were speaking, I remember somebody who was into trying to prevent poaching. And he was saying, from his point of view, when you analyse the problem, you could work right back from the people who illegally had the ivory in the country, and you could arrest them. Or you could try and deal with them at the point where it's being exported from the country, or you could deal with it at the point where it was moving through the continent. But from his point of view, preventing the animal being shot was really probably the top part, and then when he analysed how things were working at the time, that wasn't really where the focus had been. And so it got me thinking about, and it's related to my question. So my question is actually around, we are committed to trying to do something, and this is a university, but unlike, say, we're busy rewriting the climate strategy at the minute, we kind of know what we're doing. It's a difficult task, but there's a standard way of doing it, and we're going about it. In this area, I don't know if Karen would agree, it feels quite complex and difficult to know where to start and where to prioritise. So we're working on electronics, and we're working on conflict minerals and so on. But we maybe don't have a recognised analysis of the problem and a standard methodology that we could then sort of pick up and say, for this particular type of... So I'm not sure if that made sense. But the question was around, what would the advice from the panel be back to us as a university as to where to put our priority? And linked to that, is there scope for some sort of methodology or analysis of the problem that then helps us intervene depending on? Did that make sense? I've been sick, sorry, did that make sense?
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. So I think the question is around the university has recognises that there are risks, has a process in place to look at the due diligence and prioritise the risks. And that's sort of integrated and looking at integrated that within. But maybe to all of our panel questions, what do you see? And maybe start with Karen and then...
I think there is a methodology. It's been established quite a long time ago by United Nations Marrakesh Task Force, and what they did was they looked at the various stages in supply chain. Now, it isn't talking about services, so that makes it slightly more difficult. But if you're talking about goods, there is a way of doing where is it extracted? Is it somewhere where mining is an issue, and all that kind of thing. And then you weight all that up and say, well, in the case of what we're buying, can we actually do something about it? I think the challenge for us is if we're looking as a university and even as a group of universities, we actually don't have access, it's hard to believe, to our own research. There's people researching in our university and all over the UK and all over Europe into all these matters. And what we want to be able to do is make these priorities based on the best research, the most up-to-date, the most relevant, and say, you know what, if we did something in this particular product or industry, we would have the best impact. So we can see where the problems are, but what we can't yet see is where can we make the best impact? Where can we do the most good, if you like, as opposed to turning a blind eye. And I think that's really, it would be helpful if we could get help with that.
I think that's quite exciting. I'm looking to my colleague Liz Cooper, who does a lot of work linking some of our research and policy into practice and trying to look at the university as a living laboratory. And so I'd look at Mei Ling and Mary as well. You're both doing a very, very deep dive into your subjects, world-leading experts you are, becoming in your area. And I mean that seriously. How do we as an organisation, as a university, make that connection between the research that here is happening at the university and some of the really tricky and complex challenges that we face as a very large and complex organisation with supply chains that do touch across the world?
I think I agree. I think as well that it's very exciting, but I think that's not a unique problem to this issue, because I think universities generally have a difficult time communicating between disciplines, and there's just so many people doing research on actually a lot of the same things, not in communication with each other sometimes, but under one roof. So I recognize that's quite a big challenge, and I agree that Liz is doing great work in outreach with that. I would say that admitting that you don't know what you're doing, I mean, not that you don't know what you're doing, but that you, like, sort of admitting all of these challenges and actually kind of owning the complexity is is potentially the best thing that you can do as a starting point. Just because I always, in my own research, I get worried when I see companies or agencies stand with way too much confidence on an issue that they should not feel confident about. Because supply chains are constantly moving, right? I mean, a supply chain looks like something today, and it's going to look like something different tomorrow.
I think any organization that stands up as sordid, you immediately think, no, there's no way.
My last documentary I did was on Rio Tinto, mining the Olympic medals last 2012. And I was sure they were up to something. So I went to Salt Lake City to go and you know, because I knew they were doing illegal emissions and things. And I've done so much sort of defamation and slander on this YouTube video. But anyway, it's true. And I did an investigation, and they had the most beautiful, you know, PR, you know, policies and things. They were the most beautiful things you'd ever. The videos were just perfect, you know. And that's when you're always suspect, because you think, you know, actually there's definitely something going on here, you know. And I think it is really difficult. I think definitely have a conference, a university, a UK-wide conference with loads of universities getting together and talking about what they do. I think it's a really important thing. But I also think that once this act comes out in the next couple of years, you'll start to see companies and best practices emerging and how the report. I think it's a work in progress. And I think it's, like she said, it's really unique to universities, and that will be really interesting if more can be discussed about that, because you're interested in it, and that's what's the most important element, I think.
But it's not just, I mean, speaking as somebody who's totally outside the university, that sounds like a question about policy coherence in procurement, and how you develop that policy coherence. But, you know, Scottish Government are doing a lot of work on that at the moment. Obviously, there's a challenge for local authorities in England and Wales, you know, which is facing a lot of threat in terms of its procurement and its ability to act in any way flexibly about procurement. But I think that, you know, there is a lot of room for you know, working not just within the university but beyond the universities as well, with civic society and with government and with trade unions as well.
I mean, I wasn't intending just to think about the university. I think the procurement community in Scotland is quite small, actually, and we do work together. But one of the difficult things is nobody has the information. So other parts of the public sector look to the universities for the information, for the research, for what's actually going on.
I think they're going to be implementing the strategy, though, and this is what they're doing in the coming months, is that they're implementing the strategy from the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Acts, and they've set up this strategy task force, which they're going to be implementing over the next 12 months. So, not implementing, but, you know, developing. And so maybe then you'll get more answers, perhaps.
I think my only anxiety with that is having seen, as David talked about regulatory environment, the regulations around public procurement have got tighter and tighter and tighter, and the obligations come onto the buying authority. The government will tell you what you ought to do, but they won't necessarily give you the wherewithal to do it. And that's the challenge if we are talking about global supply chains.
That's a really good point. I might ask and open up for any other questions. Anybody who hasn't asked a question yet, who has something, a burning question that they'd like to raise or ask the panel. Liz, if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, not really a question, but I'm Liz Cooper. I work in the SRS department, and I do aim to work to link research and practice on procurement and supply chain issues. Just wanted to add, great discussion, wanted to add about the research linking point. If any students here are interested in exploring any of the issues that we've discussed today in projects, in dissertations, we're always really willing to work with you and to explain how procurement at this end works and supply chains, and where there's kind of niche areas where we need research. So do feel free to get in touch if you're interested in any of this. Thanks.
An excellent point. No, that's very good. Any other questions or comments or points of interest that people want to raise? Yes.
It's a question, a suggestion actually. Can I just ask whether actually the Department of Social Responsibility, you know, having a ongoing cooperation with Department of Law? My point is because these three major cluster of anti-slavery, forced labor, and trafficking, there are three big issue, you know, in the world, and I think your department can have ask a university, an umbrella lawyer, to work on it and to find the loopholes
I can answer that because I'm looking at our due diligence in terms of the Modern Slavery Act, and we want to think about what is the systems that we have in place to assess and understand the risks and prioritise the risks. And actually, there's a colleague from the School of Law who's been involved with that, our own in-house legal team, our procurement experts, and with HR sort of working together to look at that. So it is a very, very, very good point, and trying to, through our own sort of continuous improvement, make sure that we build on that expertise as well within the university.
To give an illustration about this, for instance, on supply and demand things, it's very large spectrum. Like in trafficking in person, so far I know, in point of departure itself, already there's 14 steps, which is actually the police, the state, the trade union can intervene. But the point it's been failed, and millions of people being trafficked. And I just don't know what's happening, because actually there's 14, at least. I don't know now, in 2016, intervention can be made to prevent the trafficking in person, but, we see it's not happening.
So I think, thank you, that's a very, very, very good point. And I think although maybe progress being made, I think there's lots of optimism for the Modern Slavery Act, and particularly how that will encourage transparency. And actually, as we've heard from some of the panel, in terms of that increasing transparency helps to create more awareness and create more action. I was just going to maybe do a quick whip around with all of our panelists, just a few closing comments or things that you might like to say, or observations from the conversation this evening. If anyone would like to start.
Okay. So I think it's been really great to hear the questions and to hear the other members of the panel. What I would like to do is encourage anyone who's interested to work with Liz. I think it's a key point of contact in the university on this, so that we can actually all work together. Because I think it's easy to give up and say it's too hard and turn away and have this sin of omission. But actually working together is what has changed most of the things that have changed for good in the world. So if we work together, we might actually get somewhere.
Fantastic. That's a good point. Nailin.
I would a couple of points. One, I'm really impressed that so many people came tonight. I usually talk to about 5 people in a room or something. I'm really impressed that people are so interested. And also, I would just say that, it can be really overwhelming to think about all the things that we need to change and things that need to happen. But I think, number one is your interest in the subject, and not letting go of that interest, because for the men I work with and the victims and the survivors I've worked with, staying interested in their lives and their stories is what's kept them going. So, seeing that these are individuals with families and friends and people helps you kind of look at your own life and try to make those changes. So understanding that it's really impacting another human being. Really.
Thank you. Mary.
I guess I would actually just sort of support what you've said here. I think sort of sustained interest is something that really needs to be emphasized, because typically, again, in the context of my own research with fashion activism, it's always very kind of in reaction to disasters. And if we can just kind of maintain sustained pressure and really think through what that pressure might look like and be creative with it. So to remember that you're not, you're not kind of just, at least I don't think you are, just consumer drones kind of zombieing it out, but actually thinking about how you might use your voice as a consumer, but to put pressure in lots of different creative ways on corporations. So not, kind of unpacking that buy, don't buy, buy better kind of category, and try to think through what you could do.
Thank you, Mary. And Kathy.
I guess for me, not coming from an NGO perspective, where most of our evidence comes from people, in very difficult situations. I do think that it's really important to just keep telling the stories, because in the end, the statistics, if you look back to where we were 15 years ago, statistics will tell you that the number of children of child labourers in the world has decreased, and that that there is progress. It's often you don't see it till quite a long time afterwards. So it's just keeping on telling the stories about people, and I think also challenging the stereotypes that we have, whether it's about slavery, whether it's about trafficking, and because that's the thing. Ultimately, that will enable us to push our governments to see things differently.
Thank you very much for that. I think unless there are any other further questions, we're going to draw this conversation to a close, but we would encourage you to stay part of the conversation. Today marks the first day of Fairtrade Fortnight. We've got a great series of events happening throughout the university, throughout Edinburgh. We've got a social media campaign happening as well too, if you're interested in fair trade and in some of these issues. If this is an area of interest for you for your research or your work, get involved and stay connected so that we can try to work together to build some of those linkages and look at some of these issues together. And we'd like to give a big thank you to all of you for taking the time out this evening to join us here and to be part of the conversation. So on behalf of our department and on the university, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our 4 speakers and to all of you for being here. Thank you.